Welcome everybody to this webinar. Today we're going to be focusing on how to bring together researchers, practitioners and policymakers to advance sport for all together. My name is Elizabeth Orton. I'm a Professor of Public Health at the University of Nottingham in England, and I'm also going to be the moderator for today's session. As somebody who does both research and commissioning of physical activity programmes for my local area in Leicestershire in the middle of England, I'm really keen to influence policy and also looking forward to chairing this webinar. The webinar is going to be recorded and it's going to be hosted on the TAFISA website after the session today. The mics are going to be muted automatically, but if you want to use the chat or the Q&A function to ask any questions or make comment, that's absolutely fine. If you do, please could you share your name, which organisation you come from and which country you're joining us from as well. That'd be really helpful to know. We're going to start the webinar with our impulse speaker, who is Dr. Sven Messing. Sven is a research fellow at the University of Limerick in Ireland, and he's a researcher at the WHO Collaborating Centre for Physical Activity and Public Health in Germany. Sven's research focuses on the role of public policies in promoting physical activity and how physical activity policies are monitored and evaluated. He also undertakes knowledge mobilisation activities with the WHO Collaborating Centre and is an advisor to Germany's Federal Ministry of Health. Sven's an active member of the European Network for the Promotion of Health Enhancing Physical Activity, or HEPA Europe, and the International Public Policy Association, IPPA, and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. So thanks for joining us, Sven. So over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Elizabeth. And I'm sharing my screen. Glad to get the conversation started today on the topic partnering researchers, practitioners and policymakers advancing sport for all together. I'll talk about both perspectives of the title, advancing sport for all together. Let's begin with this perspective and why this is politically relevant. I think we are all on the same page here, so I'll keep this rather short. But I want to get started also with the importance that my background is in physical activity promotion, which is a little bit broader than sport for all. So sometimes I'll be drawing on examples that are a little bit broader, maybe from other sectors, but as often as possible, I'll be speaking about sport for all, because that's what connects us all here today. And I think when we talk about advancing sports for all together and why this is politically relevant, one perspective that I hear very often is the health perspective. We know the recommendations from the World Health Organization on the importance of being active, but we also know numbers from different studies that show that 7 to 9% of the death per year happen due to or caused partly by physical inactivity. We know that 27% of the adults are inactive and 81% of adolescents. I have the references at the bottom of the slide if you want to look up certain numbers. But the importance is that this is often framed as a health problem. But I think it's important to see this from a political perspective. It's important that it's a health problem, but it's also important that it's not only a health problem. We also see that physical inactivity is often a social problem because certain parts of the population are less active than others. Often people from lower socioeconomic status or older people. So there are certain population groups who are more inactive than others, and for this reason also have to deal with more larger burden of health consequences than others. So it's important to keep this in mind in political conversation. Also that it can be an economic problem. We know the healthcare costs that are caused by diseases caused by physical inactivity. So there are some cost-effective interventions that could actually lead to economic savings. And also we need to take into consideration that we have environmental problems that can either be caused by sport for all activities or that can be solved by people being more active, commuting in an active way, walking, cycling, and I think being so I just want to show these different dimensions because I think in a political context it's very important to keep all of this in mind. Another important element I wanted to focus on is that we know that sport policies can have a positive impact on physical activity. These are some results from a review that was published a few years ago by a colleague of mine from the University of Limerick who led on this, who showed very clearly that building, and you see that each element in this table is one study. So there were a few studies specifically on policies that showed that policies that helped to build multi-purpose sport infrastructure and facilities had positive effects on physical activity behavior. And also there are quite a number of studies that deal with the question of providing free access for identified target groups is promoting physical activity or not. And the results here are a little bit less clear because sometimes it happens that you provide free access for one target group, for example, children, and then other target groups might use a facility less often, for example, older adults. So there are some studies that show that the effects can be sometimes good for one target group and less good for another target group. But important to keep this in mind that there are studies that really analyze the effectiveness of policies for promoting sports for all. And also just a small note that similar reviews have been conducted for other policy domains such as sport, school, transport, childcare, and mass media. And very often sport plays a role in these other settings as well. Another important remark I want to make at the beginning is that sometimes policies can have unintended consequences. So we have a policy example here from Canada, Children's Fitness Tax Credit. The purpose was very good, I think, of this policy to reduce the financial burden associated with registering a child in organized physical activity, including sport. They had a budget for 200 million Canadian dollars, which is massive, and I think we'd hope to have to see many physical activities with such a budget, but the policy instrument they chose was a non-refundable tax credit, which means that it reduces the amount of income tax a person pays. And a colleague from Canada, John Spence, did a few studies on this specific policy and evaluated it, and he showed, like you see the titles of the studies that he published. The rich get richer. Non-refundable tax credits are an inequitable policy instrument because obviously if we use tax credits to promote physical activity, the ones who pay more taxes benefit more versus the ones who don't pay taxes at all or pay very little amount of taxes because they have a low income. So I think this is important, referring to what I said earlier about the social problem that is related to physical activity, that if we talk about policy solutions, we need to find policy solutions that are addressing the right target groups that really need it and that are less active. So if we take this as a starting point, how can we bring researchers, practitioners, and policymakers together? I want to show you three very brief examples from very specific projects that can hopefully help to see how this can work to bring people together from different perspectives. The first one is a current project I'm leading, which has the purpose to develop a physical activity policy toolkit that would support the evaluation of public policies. And what we did in this project was that we set up a research team that is transdisciplinary. So we would have regular meetings with an advisory board where we have researchers from different backgrounds, public health, physical education, sport, and policy. But we would also have people from two national ministries, one national sport federation, and one international organization who would attend on a regular basis these advisory board meetings and provide critical input on how to shape the outcome and how to make it useful, not only from a scientific perspective, but also for policymakers and researchers. And also what is good in this particular fellowship that I have the possibility to do secondments at different organizations like Sport Ireland, WHO Europe, and the German Ministry of Health, which really helps to understand the perspectives of policymakers and practitioners better when working in these environments. So specifically about the project, and I just want to show you a few slides on some preliminary results that come primarily from semi-structured expert interviews with researchers and policymakers. And I think one, because it's not, it's also important to think about gaps and barriers. What are the barriers we need to overcome when collaborating between researchers and policymakers? And one of the elements that I found is that researchers very often have an international perspective on their topic. So we very often we can see that countries are analyzed compared to each other, that data should be comparable across countries, that researchers also have a barrier of limited capacity, time, or also limited mandate of really engaging in a national policy process. Whereas from a policymaker perspective, we see that policymakers are very often interested in very specific analysis of their policy they're responsible for, and the national context is of outstanding importance as opposed to international data comparability. And I have one quotation of a policymaker / practitioner I interviewed who said, from the sports sector, he said, what's a value to us is rather than comparing ourselves to other nations, is to compare ourselves to ourselves. So how can the country itself get better over time is more important, because contexts differ so much between countries that it's sometimes difficult to draw lessons from studies that were, or policies that worked in different contexts, even though they can be an inspiration. And I think this is also acknowledged in the expert interviews, that learnings from other countries, learning from best case studies, best practice examples is also appreciated. But the dominant perspective I found is really the importance of the national context. And another barrier I found was the limited capacity to address physical activity in policy evaluation, especially in sectors outside of sport and health, who might be less familiar with the approaches we use. And this is a quotation from a policymaker from the transport sector, who said we could be better at using the same approaches, or as close as the same approaches as the health sector uses, but we don't have any expertise right now. So there is a need to build capacity. We hope that we can address this need with at least in parts with the toolkit we are developing. But that's only one example. The other two examples will be a bit shorter. Second example, Sport Ireland, and this is, I think, an example that also shows how this can work in practice for a national sports federation. So Sport Ireland is evaluating the impact of their Sport for All programs on the physical activity levels of sport participants with a very pragmatic approach, using a single item question to assess the physical activity levels of sport participants, with 3-time data collection when participants register at the end of the program, which is usually after 3 months, and then 3-month follow-up. And the data are collected by local sport partnerships, so by the structure that Sport Ireland has in the country. But they don't do this alone. They collaborate with scientists. I think the important first collaboration was which question to use, because I think that's important to use a question that is validated and that is meaningful, that can be interpreted in a meaningful way. And also later for analyzing and interpreting the data, there are these collaborations with scientists, but there is also an internal dashboard that Sport Ireland uses, where where sport federations can see what they are doing. And my last example and last slide for today is another project where just in different countries at the moment, in 6 European countries, where we use a tool that helps to co-create policy recommendations on improving physical activity levels, where we start with a very long and systematic scientific process, scientific research, but then later we bring in a policy component to this more scientific project, where researchers, practitioners, and policymakers are involved to develop policy recommendations. We had just earlier this week a workshop with 95 individuals in Germany from all the different perspectives that I mentioned. And the idea is to really systematically collect and prioritize policy recommendations to come up with a list of 10 recommendations where people would agree that these are the most relevant and the most feasible ones to implement. So yeah, I'll leave this as a starting point and hope this contributes to the discussion. And there are a few take-home messages. I won't go through all of them in detail, but I think it's important, just to recap, that we have knowledge on what are the effective policy approaches to advance sport for all, that we keep in mind that we have different but complementary perspectives of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, and also the co-creation process. I showed you a few examples now, but I think there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Some processes can be smaller, some need maybe involvement of a larger group. It depends on what you want to achieve with this approach, and then you know if you need to involve a lot of people or if a small and efficient team would be the best for the specific purpose. So yeah, that's from my side, and I'll hand back to Elizabeth.
Okay, thanks, Sven. That was really interesting, excellent. Just in the interest of time, I've got some questions, but I think we'll save those until the end of the webinar, if that's okay, when we've got a bit more time for questions then. Nothing has popped up so far as I can see in the questions or the chat. But again, if people have questions for Sven, we will come back to that later in the session. So please do enter them there and just make it clear that that's a question for Sven. That would be great. So now we're just going to change over to a couple of questions for you as an audience. So we've got an interactive Mentimeter question that's going to come onto the screen now, where we'd like to know, and I can see people have been putting in the chat where they're from and which organisation they're from, and that's really great. So we've now got a Mentimeter question about which sector do you think plays the most critical role in advancing sport for all initiatives? So you can use the QR code or the Menti code there to enter your answers. So do you think it's researchers, practitioners, policymakers, or all of those categories of people? Okay. So who plays the most critical role in advancing sport for all initiatives? Interesting. I think that, yes, we're seeing a majority of people thinking that it's everybody's responsibility, we all have a role to play. I guess the practitioners are frontline, aren't they? So that's kind of, they know what's happening on the ground, they know who's accessing and kind of where the areas of challenge are. So yeah. And then policymakers setting the context, as Sven pointed out, some of the things we know are really effective. For example, having policies around multi-use equipment is really important, but there has to be a political will to build that kind of infrastructure. Okay, so there's still answers coming through, but I don't think the pattern's changing, that the majority of people think that we all have a role to play, although interestingly the researchers on their own are not going to make change, for it seems, in advancing sport for all. So researchers really do need to collaborate with our practitioners and policymakers to really effect change. So the second question is, what is the biggest barrier to collaboration in your experience? So if collaboration is a really important part of advancing sport for all, what are the challenges of doing that? And again, you can use the Mentimeter QR code or code number there to enter your responses. And then we're seeing the word cloud appearing. I guess things like silos, people working in silos in their particular area, their research area or their area of practice is not uncommon. It's how do we actually break that down? And I think, yeah, communication's coming up as a really important factor. So knowing who your researchers are and who your practitioners and policymakers are locally is probably a good starting point. And having the mechanisms of being able to connect those people together. So how do you ensure that the university researchers know who their local providers and practitioners are and how to get in touch with them? Okay, we're moving on now just to keep to the schedule. So we're going to move to the panel session now. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panelists, and then I have some questions for each of the panelists. And if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat as well. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ben Farai-Saunders, who's the Executive Director of the International Platform on Sport and Development. And he's leading global platform for actors using sport for sustainable development. He's also been involved in education, so he's a course director for a massive open online course on sport for sustainable development, and he's worked with the United Nations, Commonwealth, FIFA, laureates and many others in designing and evaluating policies and programmes. He has many more attributes than that, but we're quite short on time today, so I'm going to move on to Dr. Réka Veress, who is from Hungary and is EU sport policy expert and a committed person for the promotion of health and advancing physical activity. Her career started in the Hungarian ministry in charge of sport as an officer for the EU in international sport affairs in 2009, and she's been actively following and shaping EU sport policy since then, particularly focused on the development of HEPA-related actions. Welcome, Réka. Dr. Stacey Johnson, who's originally from the States, from the USA, is now living in France. And Stacey is an expert on health promotion in sports clubs and a member of HEPA working group promoting physical activity and health in sports clubs. And she's worked at INSEP, France's Olympic Training Centre, and is previously a fitness trainer, and she's currently working at the Université de Lorraine in France, and is a lecturer researcher where she primarily teaches on the sports management department. And then finally, for our panelists, I have Frank Olukohe, who's a sport for development practitioner with several years of experience working at the intersection of sport, gender equality, youth development and social inclusion. Most of Frank's work has been based in Zanzibar and other fragile contexts where sport is used not just for play, but as a practical tool for community engagement, social cohesion, and behaviour change. So welcome to our panel members. I'm going to just do a brief icebreaker question for each of you. So if you had to describe the relationship between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers using a sports analogy, what would it be and why? So I'll come to Ben first, just because you're top right on my screen.
Yeah, thanks. I would say different positions, but on the same team. Okay.
Yeah, so they're all kind of going for the same end goal, but not necessarily that, but have different roles. Yeah, Réka, how would you describe it?
Hi, everyone. I was thinking this could be a family with different generations. Let's say the policymakers are the grandparents, parents, the practitioners are the parents and children and grandchildren. You know, policymakers and parents set the rules, the values for the family. Children follow or do not follow. They do their own practice. And the researchers could be like uncles or aunts who are family members, but from an outside perspective, not the close relatives. That was my thought.
That's great. And how do we bring them into being a closer family? And I guess that's the the challenge.
Right.
Yeah. Stacey?
I was thinking about it as well, and I thought, although we're all there to play sport, for example, I think each of them is playing a different sport. So you've got different rules, different players, different opponents, but all there to kind of win the game and all there to advance their specific sport.
Yeah, and when you work across different organisations, the contexts and the cultures are so different, aren't they? And bringing them together, you know, the academic culture is very different to practitioner culture and policy. That's great. And Frank, finally.
Yes, from my perspective, and hello everyone, I would say it's a classic team sport, whereby the practitioners will be the team itself that plays every day. So maybe the players, the coaches, and the technical personnel will be the practitioners, but then the fan base will be more of the researchers, because then they have a lot of data, a lot of information about the team, where the team has come from, where the team is headed to. and what they would love to see. But then the club management or the team management at top level will be the policymakers, because then with the information and data that comes from the research informs how they want to move, but then they also have the realities of the resources available, what the objectives of the team are moving forward. So for me, that will be the correlation between the three aspects. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Frank. Okay, so I'm going to ask some questions, and hopefully we'll have time for the questions that are coming through in the Q&A as well. But I'm going to start with a question for Ben. So from your experience, Ben, what does meaningful collaboration between researchers, practitioners and policymakers look like in practice? And what makes it genuinely mutually beneficial for all parties involved?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And good to be here. Greetings to everyone from the southern tip of Africa and Cape Town. I think that, a few things. I mean, firstly, I do think that some of these boundaries between practitioners, researchers, and policymakers are artificial. I think, everyone is actually involved in the development of policies, not just government officials. This includes practitioners who have safeguarding policies, travel policies, any policy, and the same for researchers. Practitioners also should and do often engage in research, and researchers often inform policy. So firstly, I think the boundaries are a little bit artificial, and there are many people that work across research, policy, and practice. But I think that for those three sort of groups to work coherently together, there's got to be some sort of respect and collaboration in how each can assist one another. So how is policy relevant to the work you do? It's not just formulated at macro level and should be a top-down approach. There are also policies at grassroots level. How are those relevant? How is research relevant to what you do? And that also doesn't only have to be academic or published research. It can be applied research. It can be practitioner-based research, program evaluations. And then, how do we take the views of practitioners who are, most commonly implementing programs? How do we raise those up into research and policy so that they're better reflected? Because we see a huge gap between policy and practice and between research and reality, both coming down from policy to practice, but also going up from practice to policy and vice versa. And I think it's really important to work together to try to bridge those gaps in a holistic way. Thanks.
Just as a follow-on from that, Ben, so have you come across any really successful mechanisms for bringing those people together?
I think there are quite a few. I mean, and they can be in different ways. I mean, sportanddev.org, where we work, we try to bridge this gap between policy and practice. So we have resources on our website about how to develop effective policies, but we've also got resources on how to, design effective programs, and they're completely linked to one another. The course we run is also both about policies and programs. And actually, like I said earlier, I think there are quite a lot of mechanisms, both from a capacity building perspective, but then there are also, I guess, cooperation mechanisms, and maybe there should be more cooperation mechanisms, but between government and civil society, between civil society and universities, and how do these role players best interact with each other, utilizing their different strengths. I also will say it's not always easy to cooperate. There are a lot of barriers. Working with government can be very difficult. If you're a practitioner, and working with researchers can be difficult too, and vice versa. But the value of cooperating, despite the difficulties, is much greater than the value of not cooperating.
Yeah. And I guess it's making, I think you said, making things relevant to each other's kind of roles. So how do we make research relevant to practitioners' delivery on the ground? And I guess that's working together on the research problems and the research design. And similarly, how do we make sure that the research helps policymakers solve the problems they've got, whether that be economic problems or kind of productivity problems. It's kind of how do we ensure that the research and the delivery answers those. So yeah, I think they're really helpful reflections. So I'll move on to Réka now. So in your view, what does effective collaboration between researchers, practitioners and policymakers look like, particularly when we're operating across multiple governance levels? So if we're working at the EU level, national level, local level, what does that effective collaboration look like for you?
Okay, thank you. So I'm thinking on an ideal scenario, an ideal and simple scenario. In my mind, the policymakers set the priorities, be it a strategic document on a national level or lower level. The practitioners, when they do their everyday job, they keep in mind the priorities that are set by the policymakers while also following their own priorities. And the researchers help to neutrally, independently evaluate whether the policy, the priorities are met in a proper way, so kind of contributing to the monitoring and evaluation of the whole process. This is just a very simple and basic scenario, but I think this is already a level that is very challenging to meet. At least this is how I also observed it here in Hungary. I have faced it several times that we have a very nice policy document that is promising several things, but practically it's not really happening. And evaluation is also not really part of the whole policy implementation. If it is, then the actors who are benefiting from the policy funding are reporting for their own, which is also not neutral and independent, I would say. And that's why the researchers as an outside actors could play a really, really good evaluating role.
Push you on the implementation part there, because often policies are just kind of, created and they're put out there, and then there's no implementation stage. So what is the role of researchers, particularly those who might be doing implementation research? What is the role of researchers in spreading and influencing the implementation of the policy versus being that objective evaluator?
Yeah, I see two scenarios. One, when they are allowed to have a say, and when they are asked to have an opinion, and this way contributing to the whole process. This would be the ideal scenario when the scientists are used for improving the strategy and the implementation and the quality of the whole process. The other way, when the research community is not asked to put on its input on the table. Anyway, it will do because it's interested, but then sometimes it's taken as a criticism, and either it will be communicated or it won't because it doesn't serve the political perspectives.
Yeah. And so is there a stage once the policy has been made and kind of put out there? What do you see as the stage then in terms of getting that to land and be implemented on the ground? Who should be involved in that?
For example, I found this process quite motivating. We have tried to generate the first health-enhancing physical activity strategy, an active lifestyle strategy here in Hungary. And this strategy, this policy document was a combined document, not only a strategy, but already an action plan. And during the process of creating the policy document, the actors, the stakeholders were already consulted, and that way they knew what is coming. Their input were taken when phrasing the text of the policy document. So already at this development stage, the stakeholder analysis is done. And if we want to implement the priorities, then the actions need to be also predefined. Budget needs to be linked to it. We know it. So all these actors or these factors are, I think, crucial.
Yeah, and that is a real challenge, isn't it? When sometimes, well, often the budget doesn't follow the policy and people are expected to implement by being innovative or stopping doing other things. And that can be a real challenge as well.
And I have to admit that this strategy hasn't accepted since 3 years. We are working on it, but it's still not officially adopted.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a question now for Stacey. So how do you ensure that research findings are translated into actionable insights that practitioners can implement and policymakers can use to shape their regulations? And where do you think the process most commonly goes wrong?
Oh, great question. So within my research, what we've really focused on is making sure that we're including the end user. So including policymakers, and not just including them, but bringing them together. So bringing together policymakers, bringing together the end user when we're developing different types of programs or strategies or policies or, writing policy briefs, this kind of a thing. For example, we're developing coaching education for health promotion and for the coach to really understand why it's important, but then also for the federation that's connected to whatever sport they're involved in to also understand and include them within all of the developing process. So we invite them, for example, to workshops. And so we try to mix workshops together with policymakers, with those end users, so they understand each other and they understand the lingo that the other person is using. Because oftentimes what we found is sometimes when we are conducting strict research, we use very formal language that they don't understand. And so if I talk to a coach or if I talk to a sports manager about health promotion, they're automatically thinking, oh, well, what do you mean? We're health promoting because we provide sport. And so people are coming to participate in sport. And so they think that they don't need to participate because they're already doing what we're trying to research. So that's part of it is really making sure that they understand what the research is about. They understand why it's important to also have their perspective and why we really want to include them within all of this, but also making sure that as we're bringing them together, they're understanding each other. So the policymaker is understanding what the person on the ground, what that end user is needing for resources or needing for education. It could be financial resources, it could be more human resources, for example. And then we see the breakdown sometimes happening when they're not excited about it, when they don't understand it, because often it's they lack time or they lack education. We find that often in Europe, many of the coaches are volunteers. And so they really have to understand what's in it for them. How can it benefit them or their sport or directly benefit that sport participant? And so sometimes they're not showing up because they don't have that interest. And so we really have to push a lot to, sometimes it's literally going into the sports club and being face to face with somebody to understand it or to explain it to them. So they're understanding why it's important. So that we find that sometimes that breakdown is happening because they really don't understand and they already think that they're promoting health or they already think that they're on a good course for whatever the research is.
So that's so I think there's kind of two bits there I'd just like to pick up on. So the first bit about the co-production of the research, so bringing together the policymakers, the practitioners, as well as the researchers to design the actual kind of research questions and the research, whatever that is, whether it's an intervention or an analysis. And then the other bit, which is when it comes to applying it on the ground, the practitioners understanding the relevance and the importance to them. Is there something in the middle? Like, what's the bit in the middle that translates the outputs from the research into the what's to be delivered on the ground?
I think part of it is providing all of them with what we call a toolkit. So providing them with really concrete answers, providing them with case studies or with actual pieces that they can implement. For example, something as small as a poster that they can put up in a sports club, or a massive open online course, as Ben had mentioned earlier, providing them with these tools, with these things that they can actually use, so they get that better understanding. And so I think that's like the education part of it is what we're trying to provide them with, but then actual concrete products that they can play with, or they can use, or they can better understand.
That's excellent. And I think it is often overlooked, I think, in my experience at the research stage, that bit needs to happen. So you produce your academic outputs, your research papers, your conference presentations, but miss out on the actual practical application bit, because often it's not funded, is it? It's the research ends at the kind of publication stage. So I guess it's encouraging researchers to keep following that through to what's needed on the ground to translate it into practice. Yeah, thank you. So coming back to Ben, researchers, practitioners and policymakers often operate in very different timelines with very different definitions of what success is. How have you navigated these differences and kind of keep a collaborative sort of track on things?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it is challenging. There's different timelines, there's often different priorities. I think that one way of managing this is just forming, good relationships and partnerships and cooperating in a way, so NGOs partnering with universities to do research on their programs, but research that is relevant, that actually helps them improve their program or helps government evaluate a policy to see whether it's working. So I think I like a co-design and a co-preparation process with equal roles as well. So it's not just, researchers dictating it or government dictating it, but, the voices of practitioners are involved, not just as sort of beneficiaries, but as leaders as well. I think also recognizing, as I said earlier, like just the fact that there is a lot of good research actually often happening within programs and practice. And I think that sometimes we need to challenge the knowledge hierarchy where we think that, academic articles or journal articles are the most, elevated form of research. But there's a lot of program tools and evaluations that organizations are using that are very relevant. And in fact, maybe more relevant to their work than academic articles. For example, and just the same for government. There may be a lot of policies that are really relevant to practitioners and to researchers that aren't getting evaluated robustly. So I think it's breaking down those barriers. I think it's working together and trying to work out, what are the optimal roles, what are the optimal roles each actor can play. So, as an aside, I did my PhD on what are the roles for government, civil society, and universities in sport for development. How can they work together? Government has a unique ability to scale programs and regulate policy, but it's not really that flexible or responsive, whereas NGOs are because they're embedded in communities. And then we see that academics and researchers can play a role, but they cannot be located in ivory towers, looking down upon programs and participants. So it's like, how can all these sectors work together and how can they interface? Because, I think for too long, we've just, practitioners have just said, oh, we'll just let the researchers do the research and we'll just let the government make the policy. But actually, everyone's involved in policy and everyone's involved in research. And it's time to sort of break it down more and to really look at how these can effectively be co-designed and co-delivered and co-evaluated. Moving forward. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's a bit of a long answer.
No, that's really interesting. Because often when we start a research, bidding for research funding, we might start to talk about, the research question that we want to ask and we co-produce that, but then it's that managing the expectations that we might not get the funding to do the research. If we do, it's probably, it could be 2, 3, 4, 5 year programs before you kind of get your answer. So and I thought that was an interesting point where you said, there's different the hierarchy of evidence. There isn't just the kind of, coming up with the final trial or systematic review. There's other evidence that we can use. So how do we, and then often government want a concrete yes or no type answer now, not in 5 years' time. So what are your thoughts on the kind of this sort of knowledge brokering type roles where you have practitioners working in research, researchers working in government, hopefully the other reciprocal arrangements there as well? What have you any experience of that, and has that worked well?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think, you need good researchers in government, and you need good, practitioners in government, and vice versa. NGOs, I mean, it's often a question of resources, of course, but having people to monitor and evaluate programs within, grassroots practitioners is really important, and not just for compliance, not just to report to funders, but to improve and strengthen your work. And actually, it is a fundraising tool as well, having strong and solid research and evaluation of your programs to show that they can make a difference. But I think also part of this involves everyone working together and being more critical and conscious. So, we can't just expect as practitioners that, every evaluation is going to reflect positively on a program and bury, any results that show lessons or learnings. In fact, it's a strength of an organization to reflect on what hasn't worked and to improve it. And, and at the same time, I think researchers should also think about what research is really relevant for organizations. You can pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into a randomized control trial, but is that the best use of resources in a constrained environment when the results come out years after the program's already been delivered? What is the most effective way to make use of these resources together and jointly, and to really, equally involve all the different stakeholders? And it's not easy, forming these partnerships and working together, and there can be some level of conflict. But I think all of us need to reflect more critically on the role sport can play, and be less evangelical about it, because actually being evangelical about sport and proclaiming that it solves every problem in the world is simply not true. But there are ways in which, when intentionally used, designed, and evaluated, sport can make a difference in specific areas like physical health or activity. And we need to be much more balanced, targeted, and realistic about this, because we may all work in sport and believe in sport, but there are a lot of people in the world who look at the sports sector, at its governance challenges, at the elitism, at the extreme inequities, and voice doubts around the use of sport for all and sport for development and peace. And we need to counter that with real, proper evidence and robust design that doesn't just rely on assumptions or anecdotes, but goes beyond that to show the ways in which sport can meaningfully contribute to development goals. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Stacey, collaboration inevitably requires compromise. We've just heard of some of that. How do you strike the right balance between adapting the needs of the partnership and protecting each partner's ability to fulfill their own kind of responsibilities effectively?
Good question. Within my research, what we really tried to do focus on is adapting the type of partnerships and adapting the type of research, adapting what we ask of the different partners, and along the project to each individual person or each type of partner that we have, and hope that it advances those who are maybe less involved or less interested, and maybe increasing their interest. It's kind of is peaks in interest, and then they again filter it down to other people. It kind of becomes a snowball effect to get more and more people interested. But I think the adaptation is something that's huge. Like I mentioned before, it's adapting language to the people that we're talking to or that we're including. Because if I include a sport participant who is younger, they are not necessarily going to understand the language of a policymaker. Yeah. So we do that. In addition, we also sometimes we separate people into more homogeneous groups, because we find that, for example, researchers can discuss something a little differently than the practitioners can, or that NGOs can, policymakers. So often we will separate them into homogeneous groups, but then we also bring them together. So we do a little bit of heterogeneous and homogeneous groups to separate and bring together so they understand each other, but they also feel free to have discussions among like groups, shall we say. And then I think the last thing is the types of studies sometimes that we try to conduct also need to reflect who we're trying to study or what we're trying to bring together. And that way, for example, we've conducted a concept mapping study before, which is online, and it makes it easier for people to be able to participate. So it's adapting to what they need. And it also lets them participate kind of anonymously. So that way they're not worried about what they're sharing and other people thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't say this. So we adapt that. We try to ensure that they understand the what's in it for me, because at the end of the day, quite often a policymaker is going to look at it and say, okay, what's in it for us? What's in it for the policy? How is this going to improve the officials' standpoint? And then the same thing from a practitioner, a coach, or somebody like from the ground is really looking at it. Okay, why would I want to participate in this? Why would I want to promote health through my sport? What's in it for us? We're focusing on prevention, or we're focusing on different health topics, but really what's in it for me? What's in it for my sport participants? So looking at the different types of research that we conduct with focus groups or workshops, workshops and having games and such, if it's maybe a younger population, or if there are people that aren't really involved in research, having them play games within a workshop really helps as well to bring them together and then adapt to the type that
that's great, thank you. I'm going to come to Frank now. So Frank, what do you think are the most common barriers that you've encountered in cross-sector collaborations, whether these be structural, cultural, or communication related, and what concrete strategies have helped you overcome them?
Yeah, I would say from experience working at different levels, both macro, meso, and micro levels, structural barriers exist from government bureaucracies, lack of sector support in different aspects, also organizational objectives to create synergies or collaborations. Working, even at civil society levels, you find that a lot of organizations do already have fixed objectives, do have fixed targets, and compromising on that sometimes becomes a challenge. And one of the easy ways that we have worked to ensure that then we are able to achieve this is to build up upon already what is existing. If you're coming in as a practitioner in sport for development and already organizations exist within communities, the best or the easiest way is just to adapt to what they already are implementing. That means then you have to be more flexible, you have to be more adaptive, as already been observed, to the existing environment, especially if you're working within marginalized groups or vulnerable communities. We've also had cultural challenges, as already noted, worked in Zanzibar, where there was a lot of restrictions to participation, especially for women and girls in sport. There were specific sports, types of sports where women and girls can't participate in, the dress code challenges based on the cultural practices. So these are some of the things that you encounter, and you do not want to come and seem like you want to change the cultural aspects of the community. So what we've done, or what we did over the years, was to create more awareness within the communities through the community leaders, looking at what is possible. For instance, in Zanzibar, it wasn't, in some communities, especially rural ones, it wasn't possible for girls to participate in football. Then if you bring in an activity, then the best way is not to, ask girls to participate in football at that point. You'd rather go for the sports which they are much more allowed to participate in, like netball or volleyball. So that's what we have observed over the years. You build on what's already existing, and over time you can now have evidence-based results that sport is beneficial to the communities and to the specific groups that you are targeting within that community. And then lastly, I would say also infrastructural challenges are also existing, because a lot of people, especially young people, would like to participate in sports, but then they lack infrastructure, equipment, technical capacities. So tackling this, the best way is to bring in the very basic aspects of infrastructure, low-cost sports facilities that are easy to maintain within the communities themselves, because higher level facilities, again, maintenance becomes a challenge. But then also bring in very basic coach training to support activities, so that then the communities can build upon that moving forward.
Yes, thank you. And so just to pick up on a couple of points there. So the cultural challenges, have you experience of where adaptations have worked well? So where the programs that are introduced that are perhaps not, things like clothing, women participating and wearing appropriate clothing, or not having, being visible to other people, men kind of watching what's happening in activity. Do you have that experience of how programs can be effectively adapted? So rather than changing which programs you offer them, but actually adapt the program to suit the cultural challenges that exist?
Maybe if I got your question right, would be what we did when we found out that especially for women and girls, some of these challenges were already existing. It was easier to bring in the very community members to speak to the parents, to the community leaders. So we had coaches who participated, community coaches who participated in trainings, and you could bring in the basic aspects of sport and sport for development. And these coaches are already personalities within the communities that are already known. So these are the ones that go within the communities to speak about the importance and the benefits of sports for girls, for women. But then, during these awareness forums, at the beginning, you can also call the community leaders so that they can also air out their concerns. And then you are able to participatorily come up with solutions. For instance, to create or to come up with an only girls activity, so that then they can feel comfortable, and over time you are able to instill confidence in them to participate, even when boys and men come watching, or joint activities. So for me, it's to start with what's already existing or what's available, and then build up upon that. And that's where I think also research comes in very crucially, because then you're able to have evidence-based interventions with these communities as you proceed with the activities.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's great. And so how would you, still with you, Frank, how would you identify and capitalize on opportunities that emerge during collaboration, especially when they fall outside the original scope of the partnership, but could still benefit all stakeholders?
For us, first of all, is to look at what the main objectives of the projects were. Initially, the projects I've worked with, sport was a methodology, so the objectives were different. Sometimes it's about gender equality, safeguarding for girls and young women, sometimes also improvement of sports facilities. So sport in itself is very flexible. So once you identify organizations or activities that are focusing on your specific target, it's actually very easy, because then it's a matter of messaging. It's a matter of involving these already existing activities and communities into the program. So I will say sport is actually very easy, unlike if you say this excellence of sport is the main objective. No, but if you use sport as a methodology, then it's a lot easier to do that. Then you can also look at communities that are already organizing their own activities, just to steer them towards the specific messaging or the specific objectives of the project, and then bring in a bit of contribution to these activities, and then you're able to collaborate and ensure that you both achieve objectives within the same scope.
Yeah, and I guess it's creating those opportunities, isn't it, for that to happen, the space for that to happen, and the good relationships for people to be able to do that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Also, also in very honest feedback within the partner system, so that then you can ensure that moving forward you are able to collaborate more and channel, efforts and resources to activities that really are, relevant to the specific communities.
Yeah, and we may come back because you touched on the infrastructure as well and the importance of that, and that was reflected in Sven's presentation right at the beginning there. So we may come back to that later on. So final question for this section, and that's for Réka. So looking ahead, what do you see as the most promising model for long-term systemic collaboration in the Sport for All movement? What would need to change at the institutional or policy level to make that model the norm rather than the exception?
So what I saw and where I see some room for improvement in the EU sport policy field, that could be a good example also at national level, is this so-called structured dialogue procedure. And this structured dialogue is implemented regularly by the institutions of the EU, where the sports stakeholders, federations, NGOs, I think also some research communities have the possibility to have their say, their opinion. But I think we have to admit that here, without criticism, but here the more professional, top sport-oriented, Olympic sport-oriented actors have somehow a bigger say than the Sport for All movement. And I also consider part of the Sport for All movement or the local and grassroots actors who somehow do not have the right channel in this structured dialogue procedure. And this would be very important for the sake of Sport for All, health science and physical activity promotion. So the instrument itself, the structured dialogue, I think is there and very good that there is there at EU level. It could be also implemented at national level. I would be very happy to see it at Hungarian level. But not only the Olympic and elite sports actors, but also the grassroots actors should have their room to say their opinion.
Yeah. So I guess, do you think that what's needed for advancing elite sport is different to what's needed for more inclusive sport for all? Like, are there different mechanisms happening there?
Probably it depends on the topic itself, what needs to be discussed. So I do not want to overgeneralize.
Yeah. And I guess there's some of the common themes that we've heard today. There's still, even in the elite sport as well as the Sport for All, there's still an issue of, who is your end user? How do you collaborate with them? How do you co-produce with them? How do you bring people, how does everybody get their kind of win, as it were?
Yeah, and it also depends very much on the sport culture of the countries also. I face here in my own environment that the regular sport clubs are not really Sport for All based. They are rather talent care based and top sport oriented. And to shape their mentality, it's long decades process. We are trying, for example, including this sport clubs for health movement, health promoting sport clubs approach, but some clubs are just very distant from that perspective.
And I guess some of the things that are behind that might be where their funding comes from and what they're expected to achieve with that funding, and the people, the kind of metrics that they're working to.
Exactly.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you to the panel for discussing this really interesting discussion. It's so important that we think about how we get the research into practice and into policy, and the policy into practice, and supporting, and the research to evaluate it. They are also intertwined. We're now just going to move to another Mentimeter short interactive break. So that will appear on the screen. And the question is, have you or your organisation ever been part of a cross-sector collaboration? And there's some options there once it comes up, as to whether you did and how that went. So again, use the QR code or the Mentimeter code. Okay, so we're starting to see, yes, some people have, and it's gone well. Others, but it is challenging. So, but it's quite an even split there between the two. And then those who have intention to do so but haven't yet. So we've got quite a even spread across the audience. Very few people think it's relevant. So I guess that's the nature of the people who are attending today, are kind of keen to work collaboratively. Yeah, but that's really interesting that there's quite an even split there between those where it's gone well and those where there's been challenges, and those who kind of who are intending to do so. Probably slightly more challenges. I mean, it's a small sample, but maybe more who have experienced challenges. Okay, and then the final Mentimeter question is: what one thing would most improve cross-sector collaboration in your context? So what's the one thing, the takeaway thing that we should be doing to improve collaboration? So we've got communication, leadership, listening to each other, discussion. So again, on the communication theme, trust. And trust is, it's kind of takes time to establish that, doesn't it? Appreciation of others. So that's that power and equal partnerships. Honest communication, trust, very similar themes coming out. Honesty. Focus on improving the impacts. That's thinking about the end goal as well, isn't it? Not just the kind of where you're at right now. Creating sporting events, having mutual aims and objectives. Again, that's about alignment, communication, trust, power. Integrating packages on functioning at the national funding. At the national level, it's quite small. Funding. We haven't really talked very much about funding and the role that plays. Education is important. So really common themes again coming through there about knowing who your partners are across those different sectors, building up the relationships and the communications with them, and then starting to build that leadership at all levels in all organisations to kind of promote the common goals of sport for all together. So thank you for that, for interacting with that. We're now in the final presentation of the session. This is the case study presentation from Professor Simon Rosenbaum, who's from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And Simon's the co-lead of the Nexus, which is Nutrition, Exercise and Social Equity Research Group in the discipline of psychiatry and mental health. His research explores the intersection of physical activity and mental health with a focus on populations affected by trauma and social disadvantage. So thank you, Simon, for joining us, and I'll let you share your presentation.
Thanks so much, Liz. Hopefully you can see that okay.
Yeah.
Great. Firstly, I have to apologise to everyone. One, because it's past my bedtime here in Australia, and secondly, for my terrible Australian accent. So if you can't understand me, luckily I have QR codes on every slide. I'm going to rush through this quite quickly, but there's QR codes. Please don't hesitate to get in touch, email, if you'd like any other information on anything I'll share. It's been a really fascinating discussion, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share some of our work from here in Sydney. Just as a framing, the way I approach this work of Sport for All is really from the mental health sector side of things and thinking about, and so partnerships are absolutely critical to that, but thinking about what's the role of physical activity promotion from within the mental health sector. And there's two reasons for that. One, because we know the mental health benefits of physical activity and sport. And two, because we know that people living with poor mental health can be among the least likely to have access to interventions that are safe and appropriate for the conditions that they're living with. So just going straight into this idea of partnerships, and I wanted to share some resources that we've recently published on the wonderful Sport and Dev platform, thanks to Ben, who's here, in partnership with mhpss.net, which is an acronym that people may not be familiar with, but it stands for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support. And this is where our work is really focused, thinking about what's the role within the MHPSS sector of actually seeing sport become part of usual care. So there's a four-part series of animations here. They're very brief, explaining the role of physical activity for mental health practitioners. Again, going straight to some resources that speak to that direct issue of partnership between researchers, policymakers, but also people with lived experience. And for me, that's the absolute critical underpinning principle for all of our work. If we're having a discussion about a group of people who aren't in that meeting, the first thing that we try to do is ask why not, and how do we actually ensure that we can invite them in. So that lived experience voice is absolutely critical. And this was a report that was led by my colleague, Scott Teasdale, in Lancet Psychiatry, looking at the implementation of of lifestyle interventions, including sport and physical activity within mental health care. And for those that are interested, without reading the document, there's a great podcast there that was recorded by Scott and Kezia and Joe Firth on this process. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this except to mention some of the projects that we've done around the world, again, framing our approach to this, looking at the mental health impacts. We've run controlled evaluations in Lebanon, working with people affected by forced displacement, looking at rock climbing in partnership with a wonderful NGO called ClimeAid. Again, in Uganda with another wonderful organisation, Game Connect, funded by the Olympic Refuge Foundation, looking at the impact of sport-based interventions on mental health outcomes. And finally, looking at how do we actually strengthen systems, thinking about what's the training needs. If we talk about bringing sport and mental health together, how do we train sport coaches, people delivering sport and physical activity programs? How do we train them in principles of trauma-informed practice and mental health skills? And this was a project we developed through the Olympic Refuge Foundation called Sport Coach Plus. And finally, on the other side, what do our colleagues within the mental health sector, what do they need in terms of training in physical activity and sport? And how can we connect those wonderful charities and NGOs working on the ground, delivering fantastic programs? How can we build those referral pathways between those two processes? I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. Finally, that takes me to the case study, which I'm excited to talk about, which is called Addy Moves, and that's a program here in Sydney, Australia, that has been a big team effort. And this is the Addison Road Community Organisation in the inner west of Sydney. Now, Sydney, Australia, it is a high resource country, but people might be shocked to hear the rate of food insecurity and poverty that we have here in Australia. This organisation, you can see it is a food pantry on the right. And so what it is a place where anyone from the community can come to access free groceries and free food. So the people in total, this organisation, which in Australia, we shorten everything, so we call it Addy Road. Addy Road feeds somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 people every week with groceries. So the sort of people that are coming are people experiencing intersectional disadvantage. We see refugees, asylum seekers, women experiencing gender-based violence, people living with mental illness, people living with disability, a range of people experiencing trauma and social disadvantage from the community. Now, again, in partnership with Addie Road, who also have a range of other services on site. There is legal aid support. There's other sorts of supports available. We had the idea about what about a physical activity space. So you could call it a gym, but we prefer to call it a not gym. And this is the key. When we first got the keys in January 2022, it didn't look very impressive. What it looks like today is more like this. Really importantly, this is a partnership with not only researchers, policymakers, local NGOs, but also the university sector, and thinking about our students and our future health workforces. So this is a training facility for exercise physiologists. We're about to get physiotherapists, dietitians who get exposure to those unique populations that we're trying to reach. We've now delivered over 2,000 sessions. We've provided over 1,500 hours of clinical practicum to students. We have a waiting list. We have a range of referrers. So by all accounts, it's been a great success, but this didn't just happen. We didn't just get the keys, put some equipment in and say, great, we have a service. We actually spent a very long time going through a very detailed co-design process that was led by my colleague, Dr. Grace McEwen. And again, there's QR codes here to videos and other resources, and Grace published the outcome of that paper. So this was a very detailed experience-based co-design process that involved systematically collecting views of both referrers and service users to understand what it is that they would want from a service like this that was aiming to support people participating in physical activity. So again, Grace did a fantastic job there, published the paper and identified also 6 key principles. This is an infographic that was published alongside the paper. So the key themes, and I won't talk about them in detail, but just to list them: cultural safety, emotional safety, accessibility, providing support to address basic needs, thinking about physical activity literacy, and also social and community connection. So for our team at UNSW, we consider these a bit of our sort of guiding principles, and every week we are discussing how we can do better and how we can learn and what we can do to make our space better to meet the needs of the people we're trying to reach. Some quick examples here, and this was a piece written by one of our master students and one of our great practitioners, Uzma Chowdhury. You can see pictures there with some numbers corresponding to how do we actually achieve some of those things that I just mentioned. For example, cultural safety. You can see number 2 on the door. We have all our material, our referral information is in over 15 languages. We have access to interpreters who speak over 100 languages. Number 1 is a mural that was painted by 4 refugees and asylum seekers when they arrived in Australia. And that was critical to creating a space that they felt welcome and they felt some ownership over. Moving along, number 4, you can see we have some toys under that bench, and they're provided by a charity that's free kids' toys, because childcare is one of the key barriers for the people and largely the women that we're trying to reach. So if we can't occupy the kids while they get the opportunity to participate in exercise, then it won't work. Number 5, a great trick we learned from Refugee Health. We have, you can't see from here, but there are pins all over that world map. When people come in, we can make them a cup of tea, and we often ask people to pin what feels like home on that map. It's a great conversation starter, a great way of trying to achieve and build that connection, that cultural safety that we're trying to achieve. People that are interested in the program: Chiara Mastrogiovanni, one of our wonderful PhD candidates who's about to submit her PhD, published this piece in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which outlines a bit of the implementation process, and again, those partnerships that we had to create with our referrers, with some of the policymakers and the NGOs. Finally, in 60 seconds, I just wanted to point to some other work that we've done that was another big partnership between the Olympic Refuge Foundation, but also practitioners from UNHCR and a range of other agencies, looking at how we could create guidance for the mental health and psychosocial support sector around physical activity and sport. Those familiar with MHPSS may be familiar with the MHPSS pyramid, which is 4 layers that outlines how mental health support is provided in humanitarian contexts. Traditionally, there was a view that physical activity sits under layer 2 of the pyramid, but actually what we know, and what probably everyone on this call is aware, is that delivered properly, delivered safely, and through a mental health lens, physical activity can actually play a part and contribute to every level of the MHPSS pyramid. The animations I spoke about at the start also cover this and talk a lot to this point as well. Oh, we're repeating. I'm on loop. I'm sorry. I'd just like to acknowledge our team. So particularly Uzma and Kiara and Grace, Oscar, and the fantastic work that they've done in helping to set up Addy Moves. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Simon. That was really inspirational. One of the questions that came to my mind when you were speaking was often programs that are so focused on groups that have experienced trauma, the numbers of people coming into the program might be quite small relative to running, park run or, these big sort of mass participation events. How have you made the kind of the case to your funders or to policymakers, that economic case, that it is a good thing to do, even if the actual numbers or the, minutes of, MVPA as an outcome is not necessarily going to be what you're really driving at?
Yeah, I wish I'd had more funding success to actually answer that, but unfortunately we haven't. One thing I would say is, if we look at traditional approaches to engaging people that have experienced trauma or poor mental health, the interventions that we often have are not safe. And when I'm talking about safe, I don't just mean physical safety, I mean psychologically safe. If we think about, it could be things like mirrors in a gym environment, it could be lighting, it could be safe access and transport, it could be access to footpaths or whatever it might be, access to shoes and clothing. So often when I think about the physical activity guidance that we have, we tend to ignore those factors and the sort of social determinants and the real barriers that actually get in the way of people participating. So for us, it's been, again, the co-design aspect and actually having the people that we're trying to reach at the center of everything that we do is how we learn actually what's needed. So that's really been the focus for us. Funding is tricky, thinking about those partnerships. For us, the university pipeline, having students and the student workforce, that gives us a pipeline of practitioners coming through, which helps. But yeah, it's not easy keeping these services alive.
No, I'm sure it isn't. Well, thank you for your presentation. Really, really interesting. And if anybody has any specific questions for Simon, please do put them in the Q&A or into the chat. We have got a few minutes just to cover some of the questions that have come in across all of our speakers. So I'm just going to run through a couple. We haven't got time to go through them all, but I'll just pick a couple out. So this is kind of open to all the panelists, really. So in your opinion, so anybody put their hand up if you want to kind of chip into this answer, but how, according to your opinion, or how in your opinion, the partnerships between researchers, practitioners and policymakers can support the development of sport and physical activity in poorer and lower and middle income groups in the population. So specifically focusing on, the end users, if you like, the target group of poor or low socioeconomic groups. How do we kind of ensure that research, practitioner, policymaker partnership serves those groups? Ben.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Simon, for the presentation. Really interesting and important work. I think just to come back to this, and this also maybe echoes a bit what Réka was saying and maybe answers the question, is, we need policy, research, and practice to speak to each other. And we assume they do. We assume policy is evidence-based and based on research, and sometimes it is. But I think we also need to investigate this a little bit more, because as a good example, we're talking about sport for all, and there's a lot of research showing the benefits of sport for mental health, for physical health, the return on investment from, cost savings, etc., and quite well established. there's very little research showing the benefits of elite sport for physical or mental health or society. Yet, we still see country sporting policies reflecting a bias towards elite sport and investment in elite sport. So, if we truly believe in sport being used to meet the SDGs, and we truly believe in using sport in its sort of most powerful form, we need to make sure that policy and investment reflects those priorities. We need to make sure that there is already evidence showing the best and most cost-effective way for sport to make a difference is through grassroots sports, sport for all, sport for development. There was a recent World Economic Forum report that made waves and showed that the value of the participatory sports sectors is 560 million per year, and it's 4 times the value of the elite sports sector at 140 million a year. So, there is evidence, but are policymakers using it? Are we advocating for it in the right way? I think is important. So yeah, that's just, I think that it is quite clear what the best investment for society is, but it's not necessarily the way that funding is allocated. And then for these to work well, this is the type of critical approach we need to take. I think we need to be more critical about the way we invest in sport, the research we do for sport, and the way we practice sport, recognizing that it's not automatically positive, recognizing that it doesn't automatically produce benefits, but it can if implemented and used in certain ways. And those ways are the ones we need to invest in and support. And that research is the research we need to support and build partnerships towards, rather than a model of sport which does, to a certain extent, prioritize an elite and serve the needs of big business rather than the needs of communities. Anyway, so I'll stop there. It's a sort of a critical and provocative answer, but I do think it is often the elephant in the room here. And actually, there are a lot of resources in sport, and they are just not very well distributed. And I think we need to start talking about this much, much more, because if we really believe in following the evidence, then we will use certain forms of sport, including sport for all, more prominently, be less serious about serious sport and more serious about sport for all, sport for development, community sport.
Okay, that's a great summary to end on there, Ben, for you. Frank, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add to what Ben mentioned in regards to the question. For me, from experience from East Africa, will be very robust monitoring and evaluation of the sports activities at practitioner level, because I believe we already have very good existing policies at institutional or even national levels. There's a lot of research that is already ongoing, especially at the university levels here. So for the marginalized communities, it's to see what's relevant for them based on these policies. So there's a disconnect between what has already been said, but then what is happening in these communities. So if we improve on monitoring and evaluation, we'll be able to, reach these communities much better.
Yeah. And on that, Frank, we have another question that is, do we have standardized monitoring and evaluation tools to address gaps and challenges? So we heard earlier on about having a standardized sort of before and after type question that's validated. In your experience, what works well in terms of community monitoring and evaluation? That's to Frank.
Yeah, I wouldn't say we have standardized tools, but we already have templates, so many of them available that have already been built by different actors that can address this. So using these templates, they can be customized to the specific needs of what data is required or what communities or organizations are using them. So you may not need to build from scratch. There's already a lot that is existing that can really help in doing this.
Okay. So we're almost out of time now. I'll perhaps just ask one kind of open question to the panelists. If you could just think of a relatively short answer to a really big problem, and we have covered it to some degree today, but it's there's a question from the audience about how do we solve the problem of implementation? So if we've got great policies that advocate for equitable sport, physical activity for all, but we're not implementing them, what do you think? I'll come round to each of you if you could just have a think about it. What is the key thing that you think we should be doing to address that implementation challenge? So I'll start. I'm sorry to pick on you in quick succession, but I'll start with Sven. We haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah, I could have a presentation just about this topic, but I'll try to keep it short. The third example I mentioned on my slides, the project where we brought together 95 stakeholders at the beginning. That's one part of this project is really to assess the status of implementation of policies. And the idea is that by bringing people together, non-government experts, but also policymakers, that you would increase accountability, generate discussions between practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and by that help to draw attention on implementation gaps and develop recommendations that specifically address these gaps and then are hopefully implemented, adopted later.
Thank you. Réka?
Let's echo again to have this structured dialogue on a regular and on a transparent basis.
Yeah. Okay. That was short. Thank you. Stacey?
I would say tools, providing practical tools to the persons that are actually doing the implementation.
Yeah. Okay. Frank?
For me, it would be, honesty, passion, and motivation to implement sports at all levels, especially with dwindling resources channeled towards sport as a sector.
Okay, great. Simon?
I think we also have to look at who's doing the research, who has, is in that position of privilege to determine what's being researched.
Okay, yeah, good. And Ben?
I think capacity building to how to bridge these gaps between policy and practice is critical.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. And I'm sorry we haven't got round to all of the questions. There were lots and lots of questions, but hopefully you've found today as engaging and interesting as I have. There's some really important learning that I will certainly take away around that, the importance of co-production, of understanding kind of what each other's priorities are and making sure that our research and policy and practice is addressing those. And just communication, like really making the important effort to get to know who our researchers are, local practitioners, our policymakers are, to build those relationships, for me, are really, really key messages. So thank you all to the panelists and the other presenters today. There's two announcements to make for everybody. The first is that the next webinar, we're going to show a slide on the screen now to show when the next webinar is going to be. So there you have it, the 22nd of April this year, and it'll be the same, I think that's the same time as today. So revitalising traditional sports and games for today's youth, that will be the topic. So please put that in your diaries and register for that webinar. And then finally, there's the TAFISA Congress registration, which again is going to go up onto the screen. So if you're interested in attending that, then please do register. And there we have it. So that's the information that's coming up there. So there's a website that you can go to find out all the information about registration, what the programme is, and kind of how you can take part in that. And that's 13th to the 17th of May. So thank you once again, everybody. And I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been great to see so many people from so many different countries. And I look forward to the next webinar too. Thank you. Bye-bye.